My name is Zimbabwean and today I'll be presenting my research in partial fulfillment for the requirements of an honours degree at the University of Pretoria. My research topic is Representation of Women in the Zimbabwean Liberation War, a literature review. As is evidenced in my presentation, I'll begin by giving a brief background of the history of Zimbabwe, then I'll delve into a detailed introduction of my research, after which I will pose the research question, outline the aims and objectives of the study, and discuss the methodology which I will use for the research. At the end of my presentation, I shall provide a brief literature review and source list. Thank you. Zimbabwe, then known as Southern Rhodesia, was colonized by the British in 1890. This produced not only racial segregation, born as a fruit of colonialism, but also social and identity struggle. The social struggle was exacerbated because the people who were living in the lands were mostly subsistence farmers, and when the British colonizers came to settle in the country, they took the best farming lands for themselves, resulting in the indigenous people being moved to the barren and outlying lands that would not yield good harvests. The Zimbabwean Liberation War was the civil war against colonialism. The struggle started with the First Liberation War, commonly referred to as the First Chimurenga or the First Uprisings from 1896 to 1897. For the purposes of this research, focus will be on the Second Liberation War, the Second Chimurenga, which began in July 1964, according to the ZANU version of recorded history, until December 1979, as well as the representation of women after independence from colonial rule. Independence for Zimbabwe was won in April 1980 with the signing of the Lancaster House Constitution. The use of spirit mediums is one of the methods of communicating with the dead, and mediumship is known as a method of channeling spirits of the dead to the living. Spirit mediums were a respected part of Zimbabwean tradition, with some of them very highly revered. The spirit medium Nehanda, considered a Muzimu or Mondoro, which means ancestral spirit, who uses or used women as their medium, was one of the more documented spirit mediums of the Zimbabwean Liberation War. The spirit Nehanda played an integral role in the national liberation struggle, with ZANU leaders often using her in their propaganda and rhetoric. The study's first task is to investigate on the inspiration for women to join the war, which was the reincarnation of the spirit medium Nehanda. The research will look at the reasons for joining the national liberation struggle because these differed from men, with some women being seen as seeking better opportunities. It will discuss the portrayal of Shona and Ndebele women's roles and activities as is described in the various sources, and establish if the representation between these two ethnic groups is equal in their contribution to the liberation war. After comparisons between the two ethnicities, the study will discuss the portrayal of the contribution of women of the two races, for example, the white Rhodesian woman, and how her male counterpart viewed her. Several women are mentioned by name in the literature on Zimbabwean liberation struggle, particularly in Kathy Bond Stewart's Independence as Not Only for One Sex, and even fewer remembered for their contribution. The research will look at some of these women whose names stood out and what role they played in the armed struggle. Joyce Teurairo Pamujuru was one of the few women to climb the ranks of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, with very few women being able to achieve the status that she did. There are suggestions that she rose the ranks because she was married to one of the commanders of Zandla, and that is why she and a few others had positions of power. Why were there only a few number of women who managed to climb the ranks of the army? These are some of the questions that shall be answered through the course of the research paper. The elite few is the notion that only the women who had married high-ranking members of Zandla were given positions of authority, as compared to women who were not associated to any high-ranking official of Zandla. Women in the struggle are portrayed largely as fighting not only against the white colonial regime but also against patriarchal principles, which defined women as perpetual minors and hence too inept to engage with serious matters. This is perpetrated through the way that Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army ZANLA and Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army ZIPRA dealt with female recruits. Wartime experiences of women, including combatants, are different and often contradictory, with differences mainly shown in race, ethnicity, and rank within the army. An issue with the portrayal of women in Zandla propaganda is that the women would be photographed posing with rifles and grenades as if they were deployed to the front. The front is the colloquial term for fighting the colonial regime in the country. Whereas the reality of the majority of the women is that they did not get what they thought they were signing up for. Instead, they ended up fearing ammunition or being camp guards at Osibisa refugee camp. Osibisa camp was a camp specifically for ZANU and Zandla women who were pregnant or with children. The workload that they were assigned was too much because they had to be gorillas and caregivers, first aiders, and cooks. This is a quote from Nongosimba Nigavi's book, For Better or Worse, Women and Zandla in Zimbabwe's Liberation Struggle. Even when they performed all these duties, the women were still considered as less than male soldiers and not as competent to be in the front lines of the war. An example of this is shown in Nongosimba Negawi's work, where she described women who were ferrying ammunition across the borders and they were told they were not contributing as much as the men. My research question is, how are women in Zimbabwe's liberation struggle from the 1960s to the 1990s portrayed in post-colonial scholarly literature? And the aims and objectives of my research are to identify how various scholars presented the role of women in the Zimbabwe liberation struggle from the 1960s to the 1990s, to compare and contrast the various scholarly depictions of women in the Zimbabwean liberation struggle, and to identify major debates which emerge from the literature and what possible future research is necessary in this area. This is purely a literature review-based study which will evaluate a select list of post-colonial historical studies of the Zimbabwean Liberation War with a specific focus on their representation of women during the liberation struggle. You can see from my presentation that I've also touched an extended source list and a brief literature review.